Today I'm going to be tearing into this 04 YZ250 that somebody brought me here, seized up. There's a culprit right there. That's not normal. It's supposed to look like this. So cracked skirt and all the chunks of Hoy have seized up the crank. They've gotten into the lower rod. I can't spin it still. There's just chunks of aluminum. Of course you can't see them because it won't focus. Take my word for it. Anyway. So we're going to be splitting this guy here. It would take you long to show you how to do it. Really isn't that hard. Certain specialty tools that you do need and some that you don't. I'll point them out here. First and foremost, this engine stand. This engine stand sure makes things easy. For years I would go without and I would just kind of wrestle the engine, kind of bear hug it as you're tightening and unloosening things. It's kind of you can do it. It's a pain in the ass though. But this engine stand, oh man, I tell you, like that makes a hell of a difference. A lot more efficient. So not required, but if you have one, all the better. It's really nice. Next thing being a case splitter. This is a Tusk case splitter, inexpensive, works great. Again, this is something that I never used to have. It depends on your competency. I was able to get by for years without having one of these, but you have to be freaking careful when you're separating the case halves that you don't mar up the surfaces, because it's very easy to do. So you need to have your wits about you if you're going to go and do it without one of these. But if you do have one of these, it's a piece of cake, straightforward. This is what's used to physically separate the two main case halves. Next being a crank puller or installer tool. Again, this is the Tusk branded one. Never used to use these as well. Glad I have it now, because if you don't have it, oftentimes you'll end up destroying the crank, taking it out, which in most cases when I was changing cranks anyway is because the crank was already screwed. So again, it's not required, but you do want one of these. This is a mandatory tool. This is a clutch holding tool / flywheel holding tool. Depends on what bike you're working on. These are cheap. It's a Motion Pro one, I think. You can come up with one of your own, like a homemade jobby if you want. Pretty straightforward how this tool works, but I'd say this is a must. Flywheel puller is an absolute must on this bike. The one you're after, the Motion Pro 27 by 1.0 left-hand thread. This is the must. There's no way to get the flywheel off without having one of these tools. Pretty inexpensive, and this 27 here will do quite a few bikes, but yeah, this is a must-have. Another not required, but you kind of want one, is just a regular old impact gun. You'll see why in a little bit. I'm going to be starting by taking the right-hand outer case off. So we're going to be splitting it along this line here first. I have to take a bunch of stuff apart to get there. And we'll move on to the left side, the flywheel, before we start splitting it right down the middle. Let's get to work. So you don't really need to take the water pump cover off if you elect not to, but I knew I already had a full complete gasket kit with new seals and everything, so I kind of popped the cover off to begin with. I'm going to be rebuilding the water pump later on, but you don't need to take the cover off, and you don't need to take the impeller off on a YZ250. But rip out the bolt holding the Kickstarter on. This one was pretty stuck. And then I'm leaving the clutch cover on. Also, you don't need to take it off right now. I'm going to be later. And here's a pro tip. If you're ever wondering what bolt goes where, just rip yourself a piece of cardboard and outline or draw yourself a replica of the case you're looking at. Poke some holes in it and feed the bolts through. That way there's no second guessing where you got them from, unless your drawing's absolute shit. So remove all the bolts, put them in their respective holes, and you can set the cardboard off for later. And then just use a soft mallet to tap on the case to separate it. And the cover should come off. It's just a paper gasket on the mating surfaces. It'll come, wiggle, and she'll come out. At this stage, before I go taking any of this stuff apart, especially dismounting the clutch basket, I like to crack the torque on the flywheel nut on the far side. Oftentimes they're really, really tight, and of course the engine, it's going to want to spin the engine. To stop the engine from spinning, get yourself a washer, preferably aluminum. This one's just very mild steel, and you can see I've used this before for this exact job. So you want to put this washer in the primary drive, the big gear here, not the little guy. You want to mesh it between the primary drive and the big gear on the clutch outer basket. So you want to feed it in there. Don't let it break any of the aluminum tabs or anything. This will stop the engine from rotating. Now, the engine's already seized, I know that, but I don't want to spin it any more than it already has with those aluminum chunks in there. So watch your fingers when you do this too, and here's where the ugga-dugga comes in handy. It just rips off. No problem at all. Then I'm going to start to disassemble the clutch assembly. So each of these bolts has a washer and a spring behind it. You can rip them out, put them in bags. Bags are very important throughout this whole process. Don't lose the bearing. All the plates will come out. This one needs a little bit of help. They just slide out. And you can pull the clutch actuation rod there. It just slides out. And then the lock tab on here just needs to be bent with a screwdriver so you can turn the center nut. And so you just use a screwdriver and a hammer, pry and bend. And before I go disconnecting that though, I want to break the torque on the main crankshaft bolt here too. Again, using the washer trick, except this time feeding it from the top with the ugga-dugga and just a couple braps, and the main bolt comes free too. But that one can be pretty tight. And on a YZ250, it's regular thread. You get the socket for the center nut, pound it down to bend the washer a little more. Here's the clutch holding tool, holding that inner hub from spinning. Another quick brap with the impact gun, comes right off, no problem. And then all this stuff slides off. There's a washer in between the inner hub and the outer basket. Don't lose that. And then there's also going to be a washer in behind the outer basket. But you can kind of slide everything off together with the main crank output as well. And there's a little spacer underneath the main crank gear. And I'm going to zip tie everything up so that I know how it went together. Don't forget this little bearing. Some bikes have a bushing in there. And then, like I said, there's a washer that's hiding in behind. And you don't want to lose that. So if you run a zip tie through everything the way it came apart, then it's pretty straightforward when you go to put it back together. Next, the Kickstarter, just unload the spring and it kind of unwinds and it just fishes out of there. And again, there's a washer in behind there, don't lose it. The idler gear, snap ring pliers. Underneath the snap ring there's a washer, there's no washer in behind the gear. And then I'm going to remove the shift shaft, but I forgot to remove the shift lever, so that's what I'm doing now. And the shift shaft actually just slides right out. And again, a washer. Alright, flipped it over, and here's the flywheel puller. It's left-handed thread, so you want to thread it in far enough to engage quite a few threads of the tool. Hold that end, and then give it a rip with the impact, tightening it in, and what it's doing, it's forcing itself against the crank end and pulling the flywheel off. And don't lose the little Woodruff key that's in there. It might be stuck to the crank, or it might be stuck in the flywheel. Just don't lose it. Next, you remove the stator. It's just got 5 screws, I believe, holding it in. Get yourself a JIS screwdriver too. It's not a standard Phillips, these Japanese bikes. If you have a JIS screwdriver, it's similar to Phillips, but it'll engage a lot better. So remove all 5 of those screws, and that should just, stator will come right out. And removing the case saver here. And then now we can start to rip out the main case half bolts that actually hold the 2 main parts together. I actually missed one of them in this step. I didn't figure the bolt going just immediately underneath the output shaft. I didn't figure it went through both case halves, but you'll see in a second when I realize my mistake. Draw yourself another nice picture on a chicken nugget board. And here's the case splitter where it comes in handy. So it butts up against the crank end. You thread in as far as you can these posts here. Try and spread them out. And here I'm just putting load on it, pulling it in tension pulling that right hand half off the left. A few taps with the hammer. It was starting to separate on the front, but I was struggling to get it to separate in the back, and if things aren't going right, then just stop. I didn't have it loaded up too much, thankfully, and kind of seemed like there was a problem. I was missing something, so you'll see in a second here, and I go back, loosening it off here. I know there's an issue, and then I see my mistake and rip that bolt out, and it separated a lot easier after that. Just tighten this thing in, help it with a mallet every now and again. And the case splitter sure is nice. Very easy. And then you just carefully remove the right hand crankcase half off the left. And the transmission is stuck in the right here too, so just listen for anything to drop, even though there shouldn't be anything. You just set it off to the side for now. And off camera, I removed the right hand main crank bearing out of this case half, because as you can see, the crankshaft is still stuck in the left hand case half. And I plan on reusing the crank, so I don't want to just beat it out with a hammer. So here I am using the main bolt to install the puller tool, and with some flat bar so I don't damage the case, and some more flat bar in between the case halves. What I'm doing is I'm pulling the crankshaft back up and into the right hand case half. Now there's no main bearing in there anymore, so it won't be tight, but it's very tight in the left hand main bearing. So you use this puller tool to draw it up, and I got it out about over 3/4 of the way before the tool ran out of travel. And so this is where this tool comes in handy, because otherwise, to extract that crankshaft, you usually have to beat the hell out of it with a hammer, and it ruins the crank end, and yeah, it's just not good. So this is doing it properly, and if you're planning on reusing the crank, you kind of want to have one of these. So you just slowly pull it out, and you can't tell on camera, but picture the crank being pulled upwards right now. So the tool's bottomed out, I can't pull it any farther. The crank is about ready to come out of that main bearing. So I'm just going to flip it over, thread the flywheel nut on so I don't damage the threads, and then just a few taps and it came right out. Anyway, that's it for this video. Part 2 is coming later. I just need some parts. We'll catch you then.